Two little girls yanked a billionaire CEO from his luxury car. 60 seconds later, a steel beam crushed it flat. What happened next changed his life forever. The city hummed with its usual rhythm of chaos, but inside his luxury black sedan, Jonathan Crane was isolated in his own world of control. Parked just a few feet away from a towering construction site, he sat comfortably in the driver's seat, tapping irritably on his phone screen. His light blue suit was impeccable, his dark hair carefully styled, and his piercing blue eyes, cold and calculating, flicked between emails and contract updates. The man on the other end of his phone call was rambling on about deadlines, but Jonathan wasn't listening. He was used to people making excuses. Deadlines weren't missed in his world. Not unless someone was ready to pay dearly for them. The massive steel framework of the building under construction loomed just outside his window, cranes swinging overhead, cables taut with the weight of progress. Jonathan barely glanced at them. To him, it was just another project, another symbol of his empire rising above the city. He didn't notice the fraying cable high above or the slight sway of a steel beam that had begun to dance out of rhythm with the others. He didn't hear the strained metal groaning beneath the noise of his own authority. He was too focused on the contractor's pathetic justifications, his mind already calculating penalties, lawsuits, and who needed to be replaced. Then, a sharp knock on the car window jolted him from his business trance. He turned, annoyance flashing in his eyes, ready to wave away whoever was disturbing him. But what he saw made him pause. Two little girls stood outside his car. Identical. Twin girls, no more than 6 years old, with matching white dresses fluttering in the city breeze. Their chestnut hair was tied in simple braids, and their dark brown eyes were wide with urgency, not mischief. They were pulling at the door handle, their small fists tapping insistently on the glass, their voices muffled but desperate. "Get out of the car. Quickly. Right now," they shouted through the window, their tiny faces twisted in sheer panic. Jonathan's irritation boiled over. He lowered the window, his tone sharp and dismissive, as if reprimanding a pair of pranksters. "What do you want from me? This is a terrible idea for a joke. Do you know who I am?" His voice was cold, controlled, and entirely unamused. He glanced around, expecting to see a hidden camera crew or perhaps a panicked parent chasing after them. But the street was strangely empty, except for the usual noise of the construction site. The girls didn't flinch. They didn't giggle or back away. They kept tugging at the door, their voices rising in urgency. "You have to get out. Now. Please." Jonathan sighed heavily and reached for the door handle, muttering to himself about the absurdity of the situation. He was angry, not because he felt threatened, but because someone dared to disrupt his structured, predictable world with nonsense. He stepped out of the car, standing tall, ready to scold the little intruders, but what happened next disarmed him completely. The girls didn't wait. They grabbed his hand, both of them, one on each side, and pulled with surprising strength for their size. "Come with us," one of them cried. "It's not safe here." He resisted, out of instinct, confused and increasingly annoyed, but their desperation was so raw, so genuine, it unsettled him. Against every ounce of logic, he let himself be led a few steps away from his car. He was about to demand an explanation when it happened. A metallic snap, sharp and final, sliced through the air. Jonathan turned just in time to see the thick steel cable snap free, whipping through space like a serpent before the massive steel beam it held gave way. It plummeted down, slamming into the roof of his car with a deafening crash that sent a shockwave of dust and debris into the air. In an instant, the car was flattened, reduced to a mangled sculpture of twisted metal beneath thousands of pounds of steel. Jonathan froze. His mind couldn't process what had just happened. Moments ago, he had been sitting inside that car, arguing over construction deadlines, oblivious to the death hovering just above him. The girls, still clutching his hands, were trembling but unhurt. They had seen the danger before anyone else, and without hesitation, they had acted. People on the construction site were now shouting, running toward the wreckage, but Jonathan heard none of it. His entire focus was on the two small figures standing beside him, their eyes wide with fear, not for themselves, but for him. In that moment, standing amidst dust and chaos, Jonathan Crane, the man who had built his life on control and power, realized that if not for these two tiny strangers, his story would have ended right there, beneath a steel beam, in a world where his name would be remembered not for his empire, but for a single, fatal oversight. The dust had not yet settled when Jonathan's instincts kicked in, not the cold business reflexes he was known for, but something deeper, more primal. His body moved on its own as he shielded the two girls with his arms, crouching low as shards of glass and bits of metal rained around them. The air was thick, tasting of concrete and burning oil. The sound of sirens in the distance blended with the shouting voices of workers who now rushed toward the wreckage. But Jonathan heard nothing. The world had narrowed to a suffocating silence, broken only by the shallow, ragged breaths of the girls clinging to him. He could feel their small hands tightening around his wrist, as if they were holding on to him not out of fear, but to make sure he was still there, still alive. His pulse was racing, each beat louder than the chaos around them. He slowly turned his head toward the spot where his car had been. What remained was unrecognizable. The sleek, custom-designed vehicle that had once symbolized his untouchable status was now a twisted heap of blackened metal, crushed so completely that even the reinforced frame had caved in. A single minute earlier, he would have been inside, beneath that steel beam, flattened into nothing. Jonathan had built a life on the premise that control was power. Every deal, every contract, every calculated risk had been part of his tightly managed narrative of dominance. But here, with his life saved not by strategy or foresight, but by the frantic cries of two children, that illusion had shattered as easily as his car windows. The girls slowly loosened their grip, stepping back, their faces pale but composed in a way that unsettled him. They weren't crying. Their eyes reflected a mix of fear and a strange, quiet relief, as if they had expected this moment, dreaded it, but had somehow known they could stop it. Jonathan stood up, dusted off his suit reflexively, though it was pointless, the fabric was streaked with grime and ash. He looked down at the girls, struggling to find words. His instincts told him to demand answers. Who were they? Where were their parents? How had they known what was about to happen? But no words came. The questions felt empty, useless in the face of what had just occurred. Instead, he simply said, "Come with me." He wasn't sure where they would go. The crowd was growing. Site managers, security, emergency responders all converged, their voices merging into a chaotic hum of commands and questions. Jonathan, usually the commanding presence in any room, now felt like an outsider. For once, he wasn't the one giving orders, he was the man who had been pulled from death by two children no one could explain. As they stepped away from the wreckage, a foreman rushed over, his face pale, voice shaking. "Mr. Crane, are you all right?" "My God, sir, that beam. We didn't see the cable fray." "It shouldn't have." The man's words tumbled over each other, a desperate apology wrapped in shock. Jonathan raised a hand, silencing him. Later, he said, his voice quieter than usual, but edged with something unfamiliar. Vulnerability. He couldn't process technical reports or excuses right now. He just wanted to understand what had just happened on a human level. He glanced down at the girls. They were still by his side, standing quietly, their identical faces looking up at him as if waiting for what came next. It wasn't until he led them further away from the wreckage, into a quieter side street, that he finally crouched down to meet their gaze. He noticed then how their white dresses were smudged with dirt, their small shoes scuffed, and yet they carried themselves with a strange, determined composure that no child their age should possess. "What are your names?" he asked, his tone softer now, no trace of the cold executive. "Emma," said the one on the left. Evelyn, added the other. Jonathan processed their names, as if anchoring himself in something solid. Emma and Evelyn. Do you know me? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer. They shook their heads. We saw the rope moving weird, Emma said simply. It was shaking. We knew it was going to fall. But how did you know it would fall on me? Jonathan asked, unable to shake the feeling that this moment was spiraling into something far bigger than a workplace accident. Evelyn's answer was quiet, but it hit him like a hammer. We didn't. We just knew someone was going to get hurt. And we didn't want it to happen again. Again. That word echoed in his head. There was a story behind it, a story that had propelled these two tiny strangers into his path at the precise moment his life hung by a thread. His mind, conditioned to seek logic, struggled to piece it together. Yet his heart was already a step ahead, telling him this was no random encounter. These girls had intervened, not by chance, but by an instinct to save someone, even if it meant risking themselves. Jonathan stood, brushing the dust from his knees, and extended his hand. The offer was simple, instinctive. Let me take you somewhere safe. The girls hesitated only for a moment before placing their small hands in his. As their fingers wrapped around his, something shifted inside him. The cold detachment that had defined his life cracked, replaced by a feeling he hadn't recognized in years, responsibility, not as a CEO or a businessman, but as a human being who owed his life to two fragile, fearless souls. As they walked away from the site, sirens still wailing in the background, Jonathan understood one thing with unsettling clarity: his life didn't belong to him anymore. It had been handed back to him by two little girls in white dresses, and he would never be able to return it to the way it was. Something had changed. Forever. Jonathan Crane sat in the private office of his penthouse suite, staring at the city skyline that had once given him a sense of power. The glass walls reflected his own image back at him, the immaculate suit, the chiseled face, the cold blue eyes that could make grown men crumble in a boardroom. But tonight, all of that felt hollow. The weight of the day's events pressed on him in ways he couldn't quantify. He had faced countless business crises, hostile takeovers, legal battles, market crashes, but nothing had prepared him for the fragile hands of two little girls pulling him away from death. He had brought Emma and Evelyn home with him after the accident. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't even a decision. It was a reflex. He couldn't leave them behind, not in the chaos of the construction site, not in a world that had already let them down once. His staff had been baffled when he walked through the lobby holding their hands. Jonathan Crane didn't bring people home. His world was composed of ironclad contracts and negotiations, not small children with dirt-streaked faces and tired eyes. But none of that mattered now. They were asleep in the guest room, curled up next to each other like mirror images. The maids had offered to prepare proper accommodations, but the girls had insisted on staying together. Watching them drift off to sleep had stirred something in Jonathan that he wasn't ready to confront. They looked peaceful, as if the events of the day had been just another chapter in a life that had already forced them to grow up too soon. His assistant had sent him a file on them, a brief, clinical summary of two lives reduced to bullet points: Emma and Evelyn Carter, age 6, parents deceased in a construction accident last year, currently residing in a nearby shelter. No relatives. No prospects. The words stung more than he expected. They had been overlooked, forgotten by a system that filed away tragedies as statistics. But somehow, against the indifferent machinery of bureaucracy, they had found their way to him. He poured himself a drink, but the whiskey tasted bitter tonight. His mind kept replaying the moment when the beam came crashing down, the split second between life and death that he had survived only because two little girls had decided to act. They hadn't hesitated. They didn't know him, didn't owe him anything, and yet they had risked everything to save him. Jonathan had always believed in merit. You earned your place in the world through ambition, through control. But Emma and Evelyn had shattered that belief in one afternoon. They had shown him that sometimes, power meant nothing. Sometimes, life was spared not because you deserved it, but because someone else chose to give a damn when no one else would. He left his office and quietly made his way down the hallway to the guest room. The door was slightly ajar. He could hear their soft breathing, the quiet rustle of blankets. He stood in the doorway, watching them sleep. They were so small, so vulnerable, and yet they had been braver than anyone he had met in the boardrooms where fortunes were won and lost. His phone buzzed in his pocket, another contractor trying to salvage his reputation after today's disaster. Jonathan ignored it. Business could wait. For once, it wasn't the priority. He sat down in a chair beside the bed, resting his elbows on his knees, leaning forward, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of guilt. Not for the accident. That had been a mechanical failure, an oversight. But for the life he had built, a life where people like Emma and Evelyn were invisible until fate forced them into his line of sight. He had built towers, expanded his empire across continents, yet he had never once looked down to see who might be standing in their shadows. He didn't know what to do next. Adopting children had never been part of his life plan. Jonathan Crane didn't do family. He did business, control, power. But as he sat there, watching the rise and fall of their small chests as they slept, a strange thought crept into his mind, one that made his chest tighten. Perhaps control wasn't the point anymore. Maybe this was about responsibility, the kind that wasn't defined in a contract but in the quiet, unspoken promises you made when no one else was watching. He thought about their story, or rather, the fragments of it he had read. A family destroyed by negligence, swept under the rug of corporate indifference. If the irony hadn't been so bitter, he might have laughed. He had been part of that machine. He had thrived in it. And now, two of its casualties were sleeping under his roof, having saved him from becoming its next victim. A soft sound pulled him from his thoughts. Evelyn stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him, not startled, not afraid, just curious. "You're still here," she said softly, as if surprised. Jonathan smiled faintly. "I am." Emma stirred as well, mumbling something in her sleep, and Jonathan realized he didn't want to leave this room. He didn't want to go back to his sterile office or his cold penthouse balcony. For the first time, he didn't want to be alone with his empire. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted quietly, unsure if he was speaking to Evelyn or to himself. Evelyn didn't respond with words. She simply reached out a small hand, taking his in hers, squeezing gently as if to say, "It's okay not to know." In that moment, Jonathan Crane understood something fundamental. Saving his life had been no accident. These girls were in his life now, not as a debt to be repaid, but as a path to be followed. And for once, he wasn't the one in control of where it led. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jonathan Crane's penthouse, casting a golden glow across the marble floors and minimalist furniture. But despite the pristine beauty of his home, the atmosphere was different today. For the first time, it wasn't a monument to his success but a shelter for something fragile and human. The twins, Emma and Evelyn, had woken up early. Jonathan found them sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, quietly playing with a set of coasters and pretending they were building blocks. They didn't ask for toys. They didn't ask for breakfast. They simply occupied themselves, as if they were used to making the most of whatever was around them. Jonathan stood in the doorway, watching them, a strange knot forming in his chest. They looked so small in this vast, sterile space designed for executives, not children. He had built this home to impress investors, to host exclusive parties, yet it now felt empty and oversized, ill-fitting for two little girls who had no place else to go. He realized he didn't know the first thing about caring for children. He had never needed to. His world had been built to keep people at arm's length, his walls designed to keep emotions out. But now, those same walls felt suffocating. His assistant, Claire, arrived shortly after with folders of documents and an expression of cautious curiosity. She had worked for him for years, knew his habits, his moods, his ruthlessness. Seeing him like this, disheveled, tie undone, sleeves rolled up, standing in his own living room watching two orphan girls play with coasters, was a reality she hadn't anticipated. She tried to maintain her usual professional tone as she handed him a manila folder. "These are the reports you requested on Emma and Evelyn Carter. Their legal status, the shelter's file, and..." She hesitated, then added, "options for next steps." Her voice softened on those words, knowing full well this wasn't a standard business transaction. Jonathan took the folder without a word. He didn't open it. He already knew what it would say. He had read enough summaries, enough cold bureaucratic jargon to understand how the system handled children like them. A few lines about their parents' death, a list of shelters they had passed through, clinical observations about their resilience or quiet nature. None of it would capture the reality of two little girls who had saved his life without a second thought. Claire followed his gaze to the twins. "Sir, I need to ask, what do you intend to do?" Her question was layered. She wasn't just asking about logistics. She was asking if Jonathan Crane, the man who never let emotions interfere with decisions, was truly considering turning his life upside down for two children who weren't his responsibility. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He walked over to Emma and Evelyn, crouching down to their level. They looked up at him with expectant eyes, unafraid. For them, he wasn't a billionaire or a CEO. He was just the man they had pulled from danger. The man who was now, in their eyes, responsible for them. "I want to take care of you," he said, the words feeling foreign but right. "Not just for today. I want to make sure you're safe. Always." He wasn't sure how much they truly understood, but Evelyn smiled, a small, quiet smile that felt more genuine than any handshake he had ever received. Claire stood quietly, absorbing the gravity of the moment. She knew Jonathan's reputation. He didn't do charity. He didn't do attachment. But this wasn't charity. This wasn't a PR move. This was personal. After a long pause, Claire cleared her throat, stepping back into her role as his gatekeeper. "Then we'll need to start the adoption process immediately. It won't be simple, but it can be done." Jonathan nodded, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. Adoption. Fatherhood. Words that had never intersected with his life were now anchors pulling him into unfamiliar territory. He didn't know the first thing about being a parent. His life had been built on strategy, on systems, on controlling every variable. But these girls had taught him in a single afternoon that control was an illusion. Later that day, he took them out, not to an office or a corporate event, but to a small park a few blocks away. No cameras. No bodyguards. Just the three of them. The twins were hesitant at first, unsure of this strange new setting, but soon, their childhood instincts took over. Emma chased after pigeons while Evelyn collected fallen leaves, comparing their shapes with a seriousness that made him smile. He watched them from a bench, feeling out of place but content. He wasn't on a schedule. There were no meetings waiting. For once, his time belonged to someone other than himself. As he watched them play, an old memory surfaced, one he had long buried beneath years of ambition. He remembered being a boy, standing in a park not unlike this one, watching his own father speak into a phone, oblivious to his son's presence. Jonathan had sworn never to be that man. Yet somewhere along the way, in his climb to the top, he had become a colder version of him. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to be something else. When they returned to the penthouse, Jonathan found himself sitting cross-legged on the floor with them, helping assemble a jigsaw puzzle Claire had ordered on a whim. It was awkward at first, he wasn't used to being bad at things, but as the evening passed, the edges of his corporate persona began to soften. The twins didn't care that he was the CEO of a billion-dollar company. They cared that he was there, that he was trying. That night, after tucking them into bed, Jonathan sat alone in his office, staring not at financial projections or merger documents, but at family court forms. They were filled with legal jargon, but beneath it, the meaning was simple. Signing them would mean a permanent commitment, not as a guardian, but as a father. He realized, with a clarity sharper than any boardroom decision, that he wasn't rescuing them. They had rescued him. From a life of isolation, from an empire built on hollow victories. They had given him a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. As he put pen to paper, filling in his name under adoptive parent, he understood that the man who had been crushed under that steel beam had, in many ways, died that day. What remained was someone new, someone who was finally ready to build something that couldn't be measured in dollars or skyscrapers, but in trust, in shared moments, and in the quiet, unstoppable bond between a father and his daughters. The adoption process was supposed to be a formality. At least, that's what Jonathan Crane had believed when he first walked into the family court building. He had expected his name, his influence, and his resources to smooth out every wrinkle, just like they did in his corporate conquests. But as he sat in a small, unassuming room lined with outdated chairs and faded posters about child welfare, he realized that here, none of that mattered. The court didn't care about his empire. They cared about Emma and Evelyn. And that terrified him more than any business negotiation ever had. Across the table sat a social worker named Margaret Hale, a woman in her 50s with a calm, scrutinizing gaze. She had been through countless cases like this, seen every angle of human motivation. She wasn't impressed by Jonathan's tailored suit or his net worth. She cared about one thing, whether this man, this stranger, truly understood what it meant to become a father to two traumatized little girls. Margaret didn't ask the questions Jonathan had prepared for. She didn't inquire about his financial stability or his ability to provide a home. Instead, she asked, "Why you? Why do you want to be their father?" The question struck him harder than he anticipated. His instinct was to respond with something neat and strategic, a rehearsed answer that ticked all the right boxes. But as he opened his mouth, nothing came. The truth was raw, unscripted, and sitting in his throat. "I owe them my life," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. "They saved me, not just from that accident, but from a life where I thought control was everything. They made me realize how blind I've been. I don't want to pay them back, I want to build something with them. I want to be what they need, even if I don't know how yet." It was the most honest thing he had said in years. Margaret's expression didn't soften, but she nodded slowly, jotting something down. "Children like Emma and Evelyn don't need saviors, Mr. Crane. They need someone who will stay. Can you stay?" That question lingered long after the meeting ended. Over the following weeks, Jonathan's life became a delicate balancing act. He continued to run his company, but his priorities had shifted. Meetings were scheduled around school visits. Late-night strategy calls were cut short because of bedtime stories. His staff noticed the change. Some whispered about it, some admired it, but Jonathan no longer cared about their opinions. His world had been redefined by two small hands tugging at his sleeve asking him to join them on the floor for a puzzle, or a soft voice calling him to read a bedtime story. Emma and Evelyn, though still quiet, began to open up in small, almost imperceptible ways. Evelyn started leaving her drawings on Jonathan's desk, simple sketches of stick figures holding hands under bright suns. Emma, more reserved, would silently place a book on his lap and crawl next to him without saying a word. These gestures, small as they seemed, meant the world to him. They were building trust, piece by fragile piece, and Jonathan knew that was worth more than any business deal he had ever closed. But the process wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when the weight of their grief surfaced in ways that left him helpless. Nightmares that sent them running into his room, clinging to him as if he might disappear. Questions about their parents that he didn't know how to answer. Jonathan, a man used to having control over every variable, found himself navigating an emotional landscape where there were no clear solutions, no guarantees. Yet, with every hurdle, he learned to stay present. He learned that sometimes, the only thing he could offer was his presence, his steadiness in their small, chaotic storms. One evening, after a particularly difficult day filled with legal paperwork and emotional meltdowns, Jonathan sat with Claire in his office, exhaustion written across his face. She handed him a cup of coffee, watching him with an expression that was half admiration, half disbelief. "You've changed, Jonathan," she said, not as a passing remark, but as a statement of fact. "I don't think I've ever seen you fight for something that didn't have a dollar sign attached to it." Jonathan looked at her, understanding the weight of her words. "That's because this is the first thing that matters that can't be bought," he admitted. "It's terrifying." The court hearings progressed, each one chipping away at the final barrier between him and the life he was now desperate to build. Margaret, though professional as ever, began to see the depth of Jonathan's commitment. His presence in the twins' lives wasn't performative. He was there, day after day, learning to be the kind of father he had never imagined himself becoming. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Jonathan had taken Emma and Evelyn to a small community fair. It was nothing extravagant, just a modest gathering with simple games, food stalls, and a small carousel. For a man who was used to five-star galas and luxury events, it was a foreign world. But for the girls, it was magic. He watched them laugh as they tried to win a stuffed bear at a ring toss, their faces alight with a joy that was pure and unfiltered. In that moment, the noise of his corporate world faded. There was no boardroom, no quarterly report, no stock price, just their laughter echoing in his chest, filling a space he hadn't realized was empty. That evening, back in their penthouse, as he tucked them into bed, Evelyn whispered, "Are we going to stay with you forever?" The question pierced through him. It wasn't a demand, it was a quiet plea for reassurance. Jonathan sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her hair gently. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "You're home now. And I'm not going anywhere." The adoption wasn't finalized yet, but in his heart, the commitment had been made long ago. He wasn't just building a home for them, he was learning to be their home. It was messy, uncertain, filled with fears he hadn't faced before, but it was real. For once, Jonathan Crane was building something without blueprints, guided not by control, but by love. The day of the final court hearing arrived with a weight that Jonathan Crane had not felt in years. He had faced high-stakes negotiations, billion-dollar acquisitions, and courtroom battles against ruthless competitors, but nothing had prepared him for this. The family court building, small and unassuming compared to the marble and glass structures he was used to, seemed almost surreal in its simplicity. Yet, as he stood in front of its entrance, holding the hands of Emma and Evelyn, it felt like the most significant threshold he had ever crossed. The girls were dressed in matching navy blue dresses, their hair neatly braided, a faint nervousness flickering in their eyes. They didn't fully understand the legal implications of what was about to happen, but they knew, in their childlike way, that something important was at stake. Jonathan had explained to them as best as he could, that today was about making their family official, about ensuring they would never have to be apart again. They had nodded, not with joy, but with a quiet longing for security, the kind that had been absent from their lives for far too long. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was a far cry from the intimidating corporate settings Jonathan was accustomed to. The judge's bench was modest, the walls adorned with faded paintings of family scenes. There were no aggressive lawyers, no press waiting outside. This was a place designed for something more intimate, more human, and that made it all the more daunting. Margaret Hale was already there, sitting at a small table, her calm eyes observing them as they entered. Over the past weeks, her once clinical demeanor had softened. She had seen Jonathan's transformation, not through grand gestures or rehearsed speeches, but in the small, persistent ways he had shown up for Emma and Evelyn. He wasn't the man she had expected him to be, and that had made all the difference. The proceedings began, the judge a middle-aged woman with a firm yet kind voice. She reviewed the case, asked formal questions, but it was clear she was looking beyond the paperwork. She wanted to see the truth reflected in the people standing before her. Jonathan answered every question with an honesty that surprised even himself. He didn't try to present himself as the perfect parent. He admitted he was still learning, still making mistakes, but that he had no intention of walking away from this responsibility. When it was time for Emma and Evelyn to speak, the room seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn, always the more vocal of the two, spoke softly but clearly. "We want to stay with Jonathan," she said, her small hand clutching his. "He listens to us. He doesn't treat us like we're just little kids." Emma, shy but firm, simply added, "He's our person." Those words, simple and unpolished, carried a weight no legal argument could match. They didn't see him as a savior or a benefactor. They saw him as theirs. That was all that mattered. The judge's final words were formal, but as she announced the adoption was approved, a shift occurred in the room, a moment where the procedural formality gave way to something deeply personal. Jonathan felt it in his chest, a sensation unfamiliar yet undeniable. It was the feeling of belonging, not as a leader of an empire, but as a father. As they exited the courthouse, the air seemed lighter, the sun warmer. Jonathan, flanked by the twins, felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. This wasn't a victory to be celebrated with champagne or press releases. It was something quieter, more profound. They walked down the courthouse steps together, not as a man and two orphans, but as a family. Later that evening, back in the penthouse, Claire had arranged a small celebration. There were no reporters, no board members, just a few close staff members who had quietly supported Jonathan through this journey. There was a modest cake, decorated with the words, "Welcome home Emma and Evelyn," and a table set for 3. The girls were ecstatic, not because of the grandeur, but because this was theirs. Their place. Their home. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, watching as the girls laughed, sneaked extra frosting, and filled the once sterile apartment with life. He realized that the silence he had grown so accustomed to was now unbearable. He didn't want the quiet anymore. He wanted the noise, the chaos, the unpredictable mess that came with being a father. After dinner, as he tucked them into bed, Emma looked up at him and whispered, "Does this mean we're safe now?" The question was like a knife, a brutal reminder of the uncertainty they had lived with for so long. Jonathan knelt beside her, taking her hand gently. "Yes," he said, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "You're safe. You're home. No one is going to take that away from you." Evelyn, half asleep, mumbled, "You're not going to leave either, right?" Jonathan smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "I'm not going anywhere. Ever." That night, as he sat alone in his office, the city lights twinkling beyond the glass walls, Jonathan reflected on the journey that had led him here. He had spent his life building skyscrapers, constructing monuments to his success, but none of them compared to what he was building now. Emma and Evelyn didn't need a tycoon. They needed a father. And for the first time in his life, he felt ready, not because he had mastered it, but because he had finally understood that being a father wasn't about control or perfection. It was about presence. About choosing to stay, every single day. The papers were signed, the adoption was finalized, but the real work was only beginning. And Jonathan Crane, a man who had once believed power was found in dominance, now found it in the simplest, most fragile place of all, in the promise of being there when it mattered most. The following weeks unfolded in a rhythm Jonathan Crane had never known before. It wasn't the structured, high-stakes tempo of boardroom deals or strategic deadlines. This was a different kind of urgency, one where mornings started with the clatter of cereal bowls and mismatched socks, where afternoons were filled with school projects sprawled across the dining table, and evenings dissolved into storybooks, whispered secrets, and the soft weight of small heads resting on his shoulder. The penthouse, once a fortress of sterile luxury, had transformed into a living, breathing home. Jonathan had always prided himself on efficiency, on his ability to orchestrate the chaos of business with sharp precision. But now, his days were ruled by unpredictable variables. Emma's sudden fascination with building forts out of couch cushions in the middle of a video conference. Evelyn's insistence that bedtime stories had to include ridiculous made-up words. The mess, the noise, the interruptions, they weren't distractions. They were life. And slowly, Jonathan was learning to live within that chaos, not control it. At work, his staff watched the transformation with a mixture of amazement and quiet admiration. Jonathan was still the sharp, decisive leader he had always been, but there was a difference now. He listened more. Meetings became conversations rather than directives. He noticed things that had previously escaped his attention because they hadn't seemed critical. His empire was no longer a towering monument to his own ambition. It was becoming a network of people, of stories, of lives that mattered beyond their profitability. One afternoon, as Jonathan sat in his office reviewing design proposals for a new community housing project, Emma and Evelyn burst through the doors, breathless and excited. They had just returned from school with a large poster board covered in drawings and colorful stickers. "It's our Safe City project," Evelyn announced proudly, laying the board on his desk. Emma pointed to a drawing of a playground with wide, looping paths. "No dead ends," she explained, "so no one gets stuck." Jonathan smiled, realizing that their simple, intuitive designs held more wisdom than half the urban planning proposals he had reviewed that week. The girls didn't think in terms of zoning laws or infrastructure, they thought in terms of people. How they moved, how they felt. It was a perspective that had been missing in his world of blueprints and spreadsheets. Inspired, Jonathan decided to bring them into a brainstorming session with his design team the following day. The initial reaction was skepticism. High-level meetings were not a place for children, especially not for 6-year-olds armed with crayons. But as the session unfolded, the atmosphere shifted. Emma and Evelyn's ideas, though delivered with childlike simplicity, sparked conversations that the team had never considered. "What if the paths told you where people are feeling happy today?" Evelyn asked at one point. It was a whimsical question, yet it ignited a discussion about integrating real-time community feedback into city design, creating spaces that responded to the emotional pulse of its residents. Jonathan watched, equal parts amused and humbled, as his top architects and engineers took notes from his daughters. The lines between expert and novice blurred, replaced by a collective curiosity that was rare in professional environments. It was as if the girls had unlocked a part of the team's creativity that had long been buried beneath deadlines and protocols. But amidst this newfound harmony, Jonathan remained acutely aware of the fragility of it all. There were still challenges, shadows that lingered at the edges of their lives. The girls carried their trauma quietly. There were nights when Evelyn would wake from nightmares, her small frame shaking as she clung to Jonathan's shirt. Emma, ever the quieter twin, would sometimes withdraw into herself, spending hours lost in her drawings, sketching images of buildings falling, only to redraw them standing tall again. Jonathan knew he couldn't erase their past, but he could be their anchor, the constant presence they had been denied for too long. One evening, after tucking them into bed, Jonathan stood on the penthouse balcony, looking out at the city lights. Claire joined him, handing him a cup of coffee, her expression soft but curious. "You've changed this company more in the past month than in the last 5 years, she remarked, not as a compliment, but as an observation. Jonathan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because for the first time, I understand what we're supposed to be building," he said. "It's not about structures. It's about spaces where people feel seen. Places where no one feels invisible." Claire smiled. "That sounds like something they taught you." "They're teaching me every day," Jonathan admitted. The company began to shift its mission subtly but profoundly. Initiatives focusing on community engagement, child-friendly public spaces, and mental health awareness started to take shape. Investors were hesitant at first, wary of the soft-focused direction. But the public response was overwhelming. Cities welcomed Wexford's Living Paths initiative, a project inspired by Emma and Evelyn's Safe City drawings. It wasn't just PR. It was real, tangible change that people could walk through, touch, and experience. The twins became unofficial ambassadors of the project, not in a media spectacle, but in the way they interacted with the world around them. They didn't give speeches or attend board meetings, but their presence was felt in every design choice, in every decision that prioritized empathy over efficiency. For Jonathan, this wasn't redemption, it was evolution. He was no longer the man who measured success in profits alone. Every time he saw his daughters laugh without fear, every time he watched them run down a city path they had helped envision, he knew they were building something far more enduring than skyscrapers. They were building belonging. That night, as he stood in the doorway of their room, watching them sleep, he realized that fatherhood wasn't a title you earned through paperwork or promises. It was a role you chose every single day, in every small, ordinary moment. He wasn't their savior. He was their student, their protector, their home. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Crane understood that this quiet, messy, imperfect life, was the most important legacy he could ever build. The morning of the grand opening felt different from any other milestone Jonathan Crane had ever reached. It wasn't the usual adrenaline rush of sealing a multi-billion-dollar deal or unveiling another towering skyscraper that would bear his company's name. This was quieter, more intimate, but somehow far more significant. Today was not about profits or prestige, it was about people, about a vision that had been rebuilt, not in boardrooms, but in the small, honest moments shared between a father and his daughters. The Living Paths urban project had taken shape faster than anyone anticipated. What had started as crayon sketches and childlike ideas had evolved into a community-driven initiative that had captured the attention of city officials, architects, and everyday citizens alike. The public space Jonathan was about to unveil wasn't just another polished plaza filled with corporate branding. It was a living, breathing ecosystem of parks, playgrounds, interactive walkways, and quiet reflection spots, all designed with one simple principle in mind: no dead ends. Every path led somewhere. Every space welcomed you in. As Jonathan stood backstage, preparing for his brief remarks, he watched Emma and Evelyn from a distance. They were weaving through the crowd, hand in hand, their faces alight with the innocent excitement that only children could carry. They had no idea how monumental this day was for him. To them, it was simply a chance to show the world their safe city. They didn't need to understand the complexities of urban design or the political battles that had been fought behind the scenes. They had already won the most important fight, the right to be heard. When it was finally time to speak, Jonathan didn't walk onto the stage with the commanding presence that had once defined his public image. He walked slowly, deliberately, not as a CEO, but as a father. The crowd, a mixture of officials, community members, and media, quieted as he reached the podium. For a moment, he simply stood there, taking in the sight of the space that had once only existed in his daughter's imaginations. Then, he began. "I've spent my life building things," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Buildings that scrape the sky, contracts that fill portfolios, strategies that keep companies afloat. But none of that prepared me for what it truly means to build. True building is not measured in steel and glass, but in connections, in making sure that people never feel trapped, never feel invisible." He paused, his eyes finding Emma and Evelyn in the crowd. "Two little girls reminded me of that. They didn't ask for a tower or a monument. They asked for paths. Paths that always lead somewhere. Paths where no one is left behind." He didn't need to say more. The applause wasn't explosive, it was heartfelt, sustained, and personal. People weren't clapping for a corporate success story. They were clapping because, in a world where urban landscapes often felt cold and detached, someone had finally built something that felt human. After the formalities, Jonathan let the girls guide him through the park. They took him to their favorite spot, a circular playground with soft, winding paths branching out like a sunburst. Evelyn called it the kindness hub, explaining that it was designed so no one would ever feel cornered or stuck. Emma showed him a quiet garden space with reading nooks and soft benches, a place she called the listening room. Everywhere they went, Jonathan saw families, children, elderly couples, people who had come not to admire architecture but to experience a space that welcomed them in without asking anything in return. Journalists approached him, eager for sound bites, but Jonathan waved them off gently. This wasn't a day for headlines. It was a day for presence. As the afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the paths, Jonathan found himself sitting on a bench with Emma and Evelyn on either side, their small hands tucked into his. They sat in companionable silence, watching as life unfolded around them, kids playing, friends chatting, strangers smiling at each other without a rush. Claire approached quietly, sitting across from them with a knowing smile. "You know, you've built a lot of things in your life, Jonathan," she said, "but this might be the first thing that actually belongs to you." Jonathan nodded, not out of pride, but out of a deep, quiet understanding. He hadn't built this project to redeem his company or his image. He had built it because Emma and Evelyn had shown him what mattered when everything else falls away. They had shown him that legacy isn't found in towering achievements but in the spaces where people feel safe enough to breathe, to play, to be. As the day wound down, Jonathan knew the journey was far from over. Parenthood wasn't a project you completed. It was a commitment you renewed every single day. But for the first time in his life, he felt no need to control the future. He had learned to walk alongside it, hand in hand with two little girls who had taught him that leadership wasn't about leading from the front but being present at the heart. That night, as they returned home, Emma and Evelyn fell asleep against his shoulders in the car. The city lights blurred past the windows, but Jonathan didn't see them as mere landmarks anymore. He saw a living city, filled with stories, with people who deserved paths that never trapped them. In a world obsessed with building upward, Jonathan Crane had finally learned to build outward. And in doing so, he had not only found a family but had also built something that no tower, no deal, no title could ever match, a life rooted in connection, empathy, and the quiet power of staying when it matters most.